Hi everyone, welcome back. Professor Shima here. If you haven't figured it out yet, majoring in supply chain management requires that you be a jack of all trades without being an expert in any one specific thing. Before I have students come into the program, they're often worried about majoring in this niche, specialized, very focused area being supply chain management. And they think they're going to pigeonhole themselves professionally because they're majoring in this one specific niche or thing. And then they start to figure out, wait a second, this one specific niche actually requires a bunch of broad strategic skill sets that rounds me out and helps me develop a general business acumen in this field called supply chain management. So again, you have to talk to engineers, you have to be able to talk to lawyers, you need to be a data scientist and make sense out of huge amounts of data and information. You have to understand how to negotiate. You need a sales side to you. So the lists of skills required to be successful in supply chain are endless. And we're going to throw one on top of that, and that's that you have to be a financier. If you're in a buying organization and you have contracts with suppliers, those contracts are typically called purchase orders. So to keep it simple, a purchase order or a PO is simply a contract between a buyer and a supplier. With that contract is a boilerplate. A boilerplate is just an old antiquated way of saying terms and conditions. So every purchase order has terms and conditions associated with it. Feel free to email me. I have a standard list of terms and conditions that are typically associated with industrial organizations, most of which are kind of universal and applied to most industrial organizations in a buyer-supplier context. So if you'd like a copy of that, I have 20 to 30 basic ones that almost every contract will include as terms and conditions in the purchase order. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the payment terms associated with a purchase order. You see it in your finance class, and then you walk away, and then you go get a job as a supply chain professional, and then you see it again, and you think you remember what the payment terms mean, but then you have to refresh yourself. So I just want to refresh you right now and explain to you in general what these payment terms and conditions mean in the context of a buyer-supplier contract or purchase order. So a standard payment term and condition will look something like this: 2/10 net 30. Let's say you agree to payment terms that look like this with your supplier. This is basically saying, hey supplier, when you ship me the parts and I actually get the parts, I'm not going to pay you before I get the parts or the material. I'm not going to pay you as soon as I get them. I'll pay you after I get them. This is saying I'm not going to pay you until about within 30 days after receiving the parts. So these payment terms and conditions are saying I've agreed to pay you within 30 days. If I pay you after 30 days, then there will be a penalty associated with that, upon which you've probably agreed to previously. It might be 1% per day up to a certain number of days after payment was due, and then it might get higher after that. But typically, what this is basically saying, pretty standard in a buyer-supplier context, I'll pay you within 30 days. But if by chance I pay you within 10 days, I want a 2% discount on the agreed upon price. So let's say you're buying $100 of parts. If you pay them within 30 days, you pay them 30 days after receiving the parts, it'll cost you $100. You agree to that, it's on paper, it's contractual. But if by chance you get the parts and you pay them within 10 days of receiving the parts, instead of paying them $100, you're going to pay them $98. So you get a 2% discount. And again, this is pretty standard, okay? So some of the things I want to mention is that when you get a job with most of the organizations that hire from our program, a lot of our students become buyers. They tend to be buyers in organizations that are much larger than the suppliers that they do business with. So typically, you're going to probably have some leverage in the negotiation process, and you're going to have some major influence in dictating what the payment terms and conditions look like. If your company is cash strapped, it has cash flow issues, then typically what you'll try to do is you'll probably try to negotiate this part of the payment terms and conditions. In other words, I don't want to pay you within 30 days. I want to pay you within 45, 60, 90, or 120 days. You might go back and reopen the contract and negotiate new payment terms and conditions contingent on your inability to pay within 30 days. So this part is very negotiable. What's contingent is that the supplier assumes that if they agree to something that's beyond 30 days that you will eventually pay them. That's usually the case. So I've seen some companies out there, for example, negotiate payment terms where they won't pay their suppliers for within 6 months. In other words, they're going to wait 6 months to pay for parts that they received 6 months ago. What's the reason for this? There are a lot of companies out there that aren't publicly held, that are private, that are family-owned businesses, that don't like to borrow money, that pay for everything in cash, and when they want to reinvest in their company, they do so with their own cash. So I'll give you an example. I know of one first-tier supplier in the automotive industry that does business with the automotive OEMs like Ford, GM, Chrysler, and Toyota. It's a family-owned business that does a few billion a year in annual sales revenue. So this is a very, very large, privately held, family-owned business. They don't do 10 million a year. They do about $3 to $4 billion in annual sales revenue annually, and it's a family-owned business. They never borrow money from banks. They don't have any debt, and they pay for everything in cash. So they don't reinvest in their own growth unless they have cash on the sidelines. Right now, they want to build new factories in North America, and they don't want to borrow money to do so. So cash is king, and they need cash. So they've told their suppliers, look, we're not going to pay you within 30 days, 45 days, 90, or even 120 days. We're going to pay you within 180 days, and don't be shocked if we wait until the very end and don't pay you for parts we've received until 6 months after receiving the parts. And the suppliers say, wow, that's a long time. What do I get in return? Well, you get paid in 6 months, so you will get paid. But also, we're reinvesting in ourselves. And when we open up these new factories and do more business to support our growth strategies and our growth opportunities, we want you to be suppliers to those new facilities as well. So suppliers are thinking, wait, if I let them pay me in 6 months, down the road here, they're going to shift more and more volumes and business to me, and that'll be my reward for not accepting payment for 6 months after sending them parts. So there's an incentive for them to agree to that, and that seems reasonable to me. The other part of this too is, if you look at interest rates and the cost of borrowing, and I think a lot of people in supply chain management are leaving money on the table by not communicating with the finance side part of their company. I think a lot of vice presidents of supply chain management aren't talking enough to the CFO of their companies, or the CFOs aren't talking enough to their supply chain executives. I feel like a lot of the payment terms and conditions out there are a little antiquated. People forget about them, and they don't pay attention closely enough to them, and by doing so, they leave money on the table that otherwise could be taken off the table in the form of cost savings. For example, the cost of borrowing in America is really, really low. So you could borrow money at a very low rate, and if your cost of borrowing is much less than the discount you could get for paying early, you could actually make money by saving money. So for example, let's say you go back to this supplier and say, look, I'll pay you within 5 days or 3 days of receiving the parts if you change this 2 to a 4. In other words, instead of paying you $100, what if I pay you $96? That's a 4% cost savings for the buying organization, and the supplier gets their money within 3 days or 5 days instead of 10 or 30 or 6 months. And that 4% cost savings could be huge. So I think right now, in general, a lot of companies out there have cash on the sidelines, so they could pay earlier versus later, and they could go back to these contracts, maybe negotiate more favorable price discounts by being able to pay sooner than later. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is if you have cash on the sidelines, you're not financially strapped, you have money just sitting there, it might be more worthwhile for you to take that cash that's sitting there and get price discounts versus it just sitting there or sitting in a bank where interest rates are super, super low. I would also argue that if you can negotiate 4% discounts by paying early, if the cost of borrowing is less than 4%, say 3, 2, or 1, which is the case right now, you come ahead that way. So I think it's a matter of sitting down with someone important on the finance side of your company and looking at the payment terms and conditions and saying, where are we at? Do we need cash? Is cash king right now? Are we financially strapped? Or do we have good cash flow? Do we have cash on the sidelines? And try to decide which part of these payment terms and conditions you really want to concentrate on. And again, if you're strapped, you probably want to wait to pay your suppliers as long as possible. But if you're not cash strapped, maybe you want to save money, which is making money, and focus on discounts and paying suppliers earlier than later. And that might involve taking your own cash that's sitting on the sidelines, or actually going to a bank and saying, I'm going to borrow some money to do this because I still come out ahead. If my price discount is 4%, but my cost of borrowing to pay this off early is only 3, 2, or 1. I know for a fact there are a lot of banks out there where if you just hand them your contracts and hand it over, they'll manage the entire process for you, so you don't have to do a thing. So I think that's a part of this is supply chain management professionals. You have to figure out how to do your jobs better, faster, and cheaper. The most effective ways that you can do your job is, one, to help your company cut costs, which means helping your suppliers reduce their direct costs. That requires time, and you don't necessarily have time to manage this process, but there are people you could outsource this process to that can do this for you. Banks will do this for you. Maybe someone on the finance side of your company can do this for you. Your time is better spent delivering the biggest bang for the buck. And that often means helping your suppliers reduce their direct costs, not messing with their margins, and not getting into the minutia and detail of the payment terms and conditions, but recognizing that these are antiquated. You might want to revisit these with someone important on the finance side and say, should we be changing these to our advantage? Okay, I think that's about it on payment terms and conditions. I just wanted you to recognize what this stuff means. Again, this is saying that if I pay you, I have to pay you within 30 days, but if I pay you within 10 days, I get a 2% discount. These numbers on both ends here are negotiable. And if you're a buying organization that's much larger than the supplier, and for that supplier, you're a major customer, and you traditionally do pay your bills, then I think you have leverage in this situation to negotiate these terms and conditions. All right, that's it. I just want to explain that quickly and briefly. Thank you for your time.